And I'm really pleased to bring in our next guest. We're joined by Amy Ellenbogen. She's the project director of the Crown Heights Community Mediation Center in Brooklyn, and the center runs Save Our Streets. It's a Crown Heights program, and it employs former gang members and other locals with ties to the community to act as violence interrupters. Now, this program began in 2010 and is a replication of Ceasefire Group, many of you may have heard of. That's the Chicago-based group that treats violence as a public health problem rather than a criminal justice issue alone. Amy, I appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
You know, I, like many, probably learned about your group outside your community from the Times piece that ran a week ago, Joe Nocera's piece, where it was really interesting. He talked about the founder of that group in Chicago, who came back after spending a decade treating stuff like AIDS, tuberculosis in Africa, and a lot of the developing nations. And when he came back and he heard about the huge gun violence on some streets in inner city Chicago, he said, you know, this is a health epidemic, and maybe that's the way we ought to address this rather than just a crime issue. Maybe that's the way to break through this impasse we have on gun violence in this country, to really look at it differently as just a huge health concern rather than a single issue here and there of a gun thing that maybe can anesthetize the audience. It's a different way to approach it, isn't it?
When Dr. Slutkin came back to Chicago and saw the similarities between how violence was operating as a disease to what was going on in Africa, he really thought that this approach could make a difference. He noticed that there were clusters of violence in certain places in the country, just as there'd be clusters in any kind of outbreak of a disease. And he noticed that if you would take similar approaches to a public health that the public health approach normally takes, we would be able to hopefully eradicate gun violence.
I'm going to take a stab at this and tell me if I get this right. You guys take an approach which is first to try and identify where the problem happens in the community. And the best people to do that in the form of outreach are people who know the community best, people most prone to either commit violence or be targets of it. And these are people sometimes even former gang members, right? People who really know the toughest areas in the town and the principles that we're talking about here, right?
So here, we believe that the violence is being spread between very high-risk individuals, and the best people to communicate that are other people who've been formally infected by the disease. So we hire people from the neighborhood who really know the neighborhood and who also really understand the violence, and they can really use the language that makes the most sense to those people who are at risk of perpetrating violence and also at risk of experiencing violence, and can work with them closely to change the way they think and behave about gun violence. This is a behavior change model.
And to the point that I think a lot of us believe, oh, there's an inevitability here. Somebody shoots somebody, there's going to have to be retribution here. This is gangs, after all, the code that they probably have to abide by. What I learned was the majority of the gangs don't want this to happen, but once somebody takes a gun in hand and then shoots, then it sets this chain in motion. So first you identify who probably are the folks who you need to locate first. Then you have these folks called violence interrupters, where they go and they mediate before the problem even happens to say, guys, there's a better way here. It's not in your best interest to do this. And they're more receptive than we think. And then, God forbid, there is a shooting. You guys actually go directly to the hospital and talk to the victims here to try and stop a revenge killing. Explain that part of it.
We have 3 kinds of workers in our program. Outreach workers who have a case of about 12 to 15 people who all have been identified to be the highest risk for being involved in gun violence. Then we have violence interrupters who have worked together as part of the team to prevent over 150 violent conflicts since the program began. And the newest part of our program, which is our hospital responders. So we have a relationship with Kings County Hospital that when a shooting occurs in our target area and a little bit beyond, our hospital worker can come on site and work with the person possibly before they've even been operated on, work in the waiting room to try and calm people, work with family members to explain to them what's going on in the hospital, and also work with people who might be in an emotionally charged state and maybe thinking about retaliating, and help them slow down, think about what the consequences might be, and help them make other choices about how they can respond.
Explain from just a math standpoint why it'll save the taxpayers money, even if they don't care what happens in the communities, because it's much better to start on the front end than have to deal with the consequences on the back end, right?
So people are looking for ways they can get involved and stop the violence. And by having a program like this, which is relatively inexpensive, and it can have such a tremendous effect, as the research has demonstrated, it really just makes good sense.
And as you've said, violence is a learned behavior, and it can be unlearned, and at least from some of the initial data, it's bearing itself out there. Amy, I really appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.